Welcome to Gut, where we deconstruct stories of greatness to understand the psychology behind human achievement. Through deep dives into history's most transformative figures, we explore how adversity shaped them, the principles that drove them forward, hear about how they unlocked their own potential, and subscribe now and leave a rating. Enjoy. This episode contains mention of violence and mature themes. Viewer discretion is advised. There's a dressing room backstage at a boxing arena. It's humid. It smells like wintergreen rub and sweat-soaked canvas. March 17th, 1977. The kind of room where the lights buzz and the walls sweat. George Foreman is in this room, in San Juan, Puerto Rico. He is 28 years old. He has just lost a 12-round decision to a fighter named Jimmy Young, and something is wrong. He can't breathe. He's extremely dehydrated. His body is shutting down. But this is something beyond dehydration. He feels a sensation he would later describe as a giant hand reaching down and lifting him up out of his own body. He starts screaming. He tells everyone in the room that Jesus is coming alive inside him. His trainers, his cornermen, they're looking at each other. They think he's having a heart attack. Someone calls for a doctor. George runs into the shower fully clothed. He's on the tile floor, screaming, praying. The most feared heavyweight on the planet is lying on a floor in Puerto Rico, and the people around him believe he might be dying. He believed it too, and in a sense he was right, because the man who walked into that dressing room never walked out of it. We know two George Foremans. Everybody does. The first was terrifying. He entered the ring hoping his opponent might not get up. The second sold hundreds of millions of grills with a grin. He went from the most feared man in sports to a beloved American icon. The easy version of the story is that he found God and changed. And while that's true, there was a deeper question underneath. George Foreman was having an identity crisis. And the story of how he figured out who he is took 40 years, 5 marriages, a nickname his siblings gave him as a boy that turned out to be a clue for everything. Act 1, The Empty Room. George Foreman grew up in Houston's 5th Ward in the 1950s. 7 kids and 1 mom in a house with not enough of anything. His mother would bring home 1 hamburger and slice it 8 ways. 7 children and herself. That's dinner. Abuse was common in their home. His mother was exhausted, married to a man named J.D. Foreman who drank and disappeared for stretches. George loved his mother and eventually forgave her, but not before telling her at 13 years old that he wasn't going to take this treatment much longer. George was big for his age, but size made him a target. His siblings teased him constantly. They called him a nickname he didn't understand, Mohead. They told him he didn't look like anyone else in the family, that he must have been dropped off on the doorstep. He punched back, though. He always punched back. Remember that nickname, Mohead. We're going to come back to it. At 15, George dropped out of school. By his own admission, he spent time as a mugger. One time when he was fleeing from the police, he ran under a house and covered himself in sewage just to escape the police dogs. At 16, he saw a TV ad for the Job Corps and convinced his mother to sign him up. He shipped out to Pleasanton, California, where he earned his GED and discovered boxing. He didn't approach it like a sport. He approached it the way he'd approached the 5th Ward. Hit first. Hit hardest. Make sure no one gets close enough to hurt you. Survive. And it turned out that George could hit harder than almost anyone his trainers had ever seen. Within 2 years, he'd gone from a kid who couldn't properly throw a jab to the top amateur heavyweight in the country. His trainers couldn't explain it. He was fast for his size, but what set him apart was the force. People who sparred with him talked about it like it was a car accident. 1968 Olympics, Mexico City. George is 19 years old and has been boxing for barely 3 years. He wins the gold medal in the heavyweight division, stopping a Soviet fighter in the second round. The referee doesn't even let it continue. George waves a small American flag in the ring. America claims him. But the American public still boos him at professional fights. He's too big, too quiet, too unsettling. And this is where it helps to know something that the boxing histories usually leave out. George was a deeply sensitive person performing in sensitivity. The boos actually got to him. He cared enormously about what people thought. He built the persona precisely because he cared so much. So he studies Sonny Liston, the scowl, the dead eyes. Of all the heavyweights available as models, Ali was right there, Joe Louis, Sugar Ray, men who were feared and loved. George picked the fighter that nobody rooted for, the one who died alone in Vegas. George tells himself, "I'm a bad fella." And it works. After turning professional, George destroys everyone in front of him. 37 wins, 34 knockouts. Nobody lasts against him. In January 1973, he gets his shot at the heavyweight championship against Joe Frazier, who at that point is one of the most respected fighters alive, the man who handed Muhammad Ali his first loss. George knocks Frazier down 6 times in 2 rounds. The referee stops it. George Foreman is the heavyweight champion of the world at 24. The boxing press says he might be the hardest puncher who ever lived. In December 1971, he marries his first wife, Adrienne Calhoun. They'd met on a blind date, but the marriage couldn't survive what George was becoming. He had an affair with a woman named Pamela Clay, who became the mother of his first son, George Jr. By February 1974, the marriage was over. 3 years. Adrienne later said that she thought she was going to be married forever. October 1974, Zaire. The Rumble in the Jungle. This is, at the time, the most anticipated boxing match in history. The dictator of Zaire had put up $10 million to host it. George is the heavyweight champion, undefeated, and expected to destroy Muhammad Ali, who is attempting one of the greatest comebacks in sports. The whole world is watching, literally. An estimated 1 billion people watched globally. Before the fight begins, George has already lost the crowd. What few people know is that George brought his pet German Shepherd with him to Zaire, a dog named Dago. George loved this dog. What no one in his crew apparently thought to tell him is that the Belgian colonial police had used German Shepherds to terrorize the Congolese people for decades. The dog that made George feel safe made an entire nation see him as the enemy. A man who grew up in the Fifth Ward, cast as the symbol of colonial terror because of his pet. The crowd chanted, "Ali, kill him." 60,000 people cheering against him. And George absorbed it alone. Ali uses the rope-a-dope method, which is where you lean against the ropes and allow them to absorb the shock of the punches instead of your body. He lets George tire himself out, until George has nothing left. In the 8th, Ali puts him on the canvas. George doesn't beat the count and doesn't get back up. He's wearing red velvet trunks. Remember that detail. Ali walked into Zaire knowing he could lose, and that acceptance made him creative. George walked in believing loss was impossible, and that belief made him brittle. When the impossible happened, he shattered. For years afterward, he bargains. He says the ropes were too loose. The count on the floor was too fast. Someone put something in my water. After Zaire, George is at the lowest point in his life. He's lost the title. He's lost his ex-wife. And then his sister Gloria sits him down. "I have something to tell you. You know Daddy's not really your daddy," she says. "Stop lying," George snaps. "Do you remember when we used to call you Mohead?" Gloria asks. "We weren't saying Mohead. We were saying Moorhead. Leroy Moorhead was his name. He wrote our mom a letter saying he'd like to meet you." George is 25. He's just lost the heavyweight championship. And now he learns that the name that he's been carrying his entire life isn't his. J.D. Foreman, the man who drank and disappeared, wasn't his biological father. His real father was someone named Leroy, a decorated World War II veteran apparently from Arkansas. And the nickname Mohead, the one his siblings taunted him with for years, it was his real father's name. A cruelty and a clue were the same word. Shortly after, George met Leroy in a church. By all accounts, the two liked each other immediately. Leroy died a few years later. At the funeral, a flag and a service pistol were presented to the son he hardly knew. George looked into the open casket and thought, "Man, that is my father." Or could have been. After Zaire and the reveal about his identity, George begins to spiral. He stages a 5-man exhibition in Toronto, fights 5 opponents in one night. Chaos ensues. Trainers are fighting each other. The crowd is going crazy. And then Ron Lyle in January 1976. Lyle is a dangerous heavyweight who'd once been convicted of murder and served time in a Colorado prison. This is not the safest fight. Before the bell, George makes a private vow. "Before I lose, I'll die. He's gonna have to kill me tonight." In October 1977, the same year as Puerto Rico, George marries his second wife, Cynthia Lewis. She's 20. Cynthia was crowned Miss Black Teenage America at 15 years old. Years later, she'll adapt her experience of being married to George Foreman into a one-woman play. It's titled Bruised But Not Broken. She accused George of physical and emotional abuse. He never addressed the claims publicly. Now, George is in that dressing room in Puerto Rico. He's lost the title. He's lost Adrienne. He's lost his name that was never his. He's destroying Cynthia. His mother won't watch him fight. His siblings spent his childhood telling the truth in code. Puerto Rico is where the structure finally gives way. Act 2, The Dump Yard. Back to the dressing room floor, Puerto Rico, March 1977. George is in physical and spiritual agony. He believes he's dying, and in that extremity, he makes a bargain. The exact words vary across interviews, but the core is consistent. He promises God that if the pain stops, he will spend the rest of his life telling people they can survive anything. Everything he's been for the last decade is surrendered on that tile floor. The rage that got him out of the 5th Ward, the gold medal, the title, the scowl. He's putting it all down voluntarily, and he has no idea what's going to replace it. He later described what he felt on the floor. "I want to tell everybody that there really is a living God. When I left boxing in 1977 to be a preacher, I couldn't make a fist after I learned about Jesus Christ. The opponent he used to see in the bag, the face he'd project onto the leather to fuel his rage, was gone. He couldn't concentrate like that anymore." His marriage to Cynthia ends around 1979, 2 years. Then in 1981, he marries Sharon Goodson. That lasts less than a year. In 1982, he marries Andrea Skeet. That lasts until 1985. Andrea gives him 2 children, a son, George, and a daughter, Frida. Remember that name. George becomes an ordained minister in 1980. He founds the Church of the Lord Jesus Christ on Lone Oak Road in Northeast Houston, a holiness Pentecostal church. It starts small: Bible studies, revival tents, humble living rooms. He leads 3 services a week. He plays guitar, he sings, though by most accounts, his singing was not a strong suit. He makes up for it with volume and conviction. By coincidence, while George is doing street ministry, he picks a street corner that is close to where J.D. Foreman lives. The man whose name George carried, the alcoholic who disappeared. J.D. comes to a service the next week. He tells George's mother something happened to that boy. "I gotta go find out what it was." After that, J.D. Foreman never takes another drink. He and George go to church together as brothers until J.D. dies. In 1983, George's younger brother Roy has an idea: start a youth center where kids can learn to box. George donates his old equipment, and then he starts showing up himself. The George Foreman Youth and Community Center opens in Lone Oak Road, same street as the church. Kids come in wanting to learn how to fight. George teaches them they don't need anger. He becomes a father figure to kids who've lost their direction. He's doing with strangers' children what he couldn't do with his own. During these years, George faces a custody dispute. He thinks about King Solomon, the story where the real mother gives up her claim rather than see her baby harmed. George surrenders custody rather than drag his kids through a fight. Then goes off and cries for days. In March 1985, George marries Mary Joan Martley. She's from St. Lucia. He calls her Joan. This is his 5th marriage, and this one holds. Joan will still be with him 40 years later until the day he dies. George said that the best thing that happened to him was finding a wife who understood that children aren't something that you can have today and say that that was something that happened in the past. By 1986, George is out of money. All of it. The youth center on Lone Oak Road is running on fumes. The church is small. The grill hasn't even been invented yet. There is no income. George later described the moment simply, "One day something profound happened to me. I went broke." He knows one thing that's tied to income. He knows how to box. And the youth center is desperate. So in 1987, at 38 years old, overweight, a decade removed from professional boxing, George Foreman announces his comeback. For context, most heavyweight boxers retire in their early 30s. The idea of a 38-year-old who hasn't fought in 10 years competing at the highest level to the boxing establishment was absurd. George isn't doing it for the belt this time. He's doing it for the kids on Lone Oak Road. The reaction in the press is vicious. Big, fat joke, hamburger clown, sideshow. The boxing establishment treats him as comedy. George doesn't try to get lean. He embraces the weight. When reporters call him fat, he poses with trays of cheeseburgers for press photos. He grins, he cracks jokes, he makes himself look like the punchline on purpose. If your opponent thinks you're a joke, they underestimate you. And his fighting style changed. He develops a cross-armed shell defense. He's patient. He waits for openings instead of bulldozing through people. He fights like a man who's learned that absorbing punishment and surviving it can be more effective than trying to destroy everything in his path. April 19, 1991, Atlantic City. George has been fighting his way back for 4 years. He's 42 years old now and weighs 257 pounds. His opponent, Evander Holyfield, is 28, weighs 208, and is the undisputed heavyweight champion of the world, holding the WBA, WBC, and IBF belts simultaneously. This is George's first real title shot since the Rumble in the Jungle against Ali 17 years ago. They call it the Battle of the Ages. George is a 4-1 underdog. Almost nobody bets on George. One boxing writer even calls it a farce. George hasn't fought his way into this fight. He talked his way into it. I don't see him getting through the second round. Then in round 7, George hits Holyfield with a right hand that staggers the champion. Holyfield fires back with a 15-second combination that has George teetering. Ring Magazine later compares it to the round of Hagler-Hearns. It is, by any measure, a war. Holyfield wins by unanimous decision. But afterward, Holyfield admits that George hit him harder than anyone he'd ever faced. He went back to his corner between rounds and asked his trainer if all his teeth were still in his mouth. George maintains that after the fight, "Yes, I lost, but I made a point." Everyone assumes that's it. The old man gave it a shot. It wasn't enough. Time to retire for real. George is 42 and he lost. Nobody expects what comes next. 3 more years pass. George keeps fighting, keeps winning, keeps funding the youth center. The skeptics have now mostly stopped laughing. No one's expecting a miracle. By 1994, George's daughter Frida is a teenager. They're not on speaking terms. The specifics aren't fully public, but the shape is familiar. George has been absent during years that mattered. November 5th, 1994, 3.5 years after the Holyfield loss. He's now 45 years old. And he gets a second title shot, this time against Michael Moorer, who holds the IBF and WBA heavyweight championships. Moorer is 26, undefeated at 35-0, and is considered one of the best heavyweights in the world. George walks into the ring for the heavyweight championship of the world. George Foreman versus Michael Moorer, MGM Grand, Las Vegas. He's wearing red velvet trunks. The same red velvet trunks that he wore in Zaire 20 years ago, the night Ali beat him, the night 60,000 people chanted for his opponent to kill him. He's wearing them on purpose. For 9 rounds, Moorer picks him apart. George is losing on all 3 scorecards. He looks slow. He looks old. Somewhere outside Las Vegas, his daughter Frida is sitting in front of a television, watching the fight, rooting for his opponent. In the 10th round, George lands a right hand. Patient, precise. Moorer drops, and he doesn't get up. George Foreman, at 45, is the oldest heavyweight champion in history. He kneels. He prays. Meanwhile, Frida's mother calls her. Don't you dare destroy your relationship with your father. It's way too important. Act 3, The Preacher. George Foreman Grill ended up making George over $200 million, more than double his entire boxing career. He later sold the naming rights alone for $138 million. So what was the sophisticated business strategy behind the most successful celebrity endorsement in history? His wife Joan cooked him a burger on the prototype. She told him the grease drained off. She liked it. He was also promised 16 free grills, and he had 16 people in mind to give them to. 16 free grills. That was the whole plan. In their later years, George and Muhammad Ali became close friends, talked to each other on the phone regularly. The man George once wanted to kill became the person who understood the scale of his life. George had 12 children, 5 sons, 7 daughters, and he did something with those 5 boys that people have been laughing about for decades, something that looks like ego from the outside. But if you've been listening to this story, you might have already figured out what it was. He named every single one of his sons George Edward Foreman. George Jr., George III, George IV, George V, George VI. They went by nicknames: Monk, Big Wheel, Red, Little Joey. He even had a daughter named Georgetta. George said, "I named all my sons George Edward Foreman so they would always have something in common. If one of us goes up, we all go up together. And if one goes down, we all go down together." Now think about what we talked about at the end of Act 1, Mohead, a word his siblings taunted him with that turned out to be Moorhead. J.D. Foreman, the name on his birth certificate, belonged to a man who drank and disappeared. Leroy Moorhead, the name that had been hidden from him, belonged to a veteran who died before George could get to know him. So he took his own name, the one he'd burned down on the dressing room floor and spent a decade rebuilding. He planted it in his children. 5 sons, 5 anchors, 5 guarantees that the name George Edward Foreman would finally mean something permanent. That no child of his would ever carry a name that connected to nothing. Critics saw ego. George was building roots that he was never given. George and Joan stayed married for 40 years. After 4 marriages that couldn't survive who he'd been, the 5th one held. Frida eventually reconciled with her father. She became a professional boxer herself, who won 5 of her 6 fights, retired in 2001. In 2019, Frida died at age 42. Her death was ruled an apparent suicide. George was at the funeral. George Foreman died on March 21, 2025 in a hospital room in Houston. He was 76 years old. The church on Lone Oak Road is still open. The youth center his brother Roy dreamed up, and George went broke keeping alive, is still serving kids today. He was a devout preacher, a devoted husband, a loving father, and a proud grandfather. He was also a man who terrified people for a decade, who destroyed 4 marriages, who carried a name that wasn't his, who found his real father too late, who lost a daughter that he'd once been estranged from. The transformation didn't erase any of that. George once said, "A man may as well be dead without a dream." But George's lesson isn't about holding on to your dream. His dream changed completely. First, he dreamed of being feared, then of being saved, then of being useful, then of being a good father, which is the hardest dream of all for a man who never had the model. The dream changed, but dreaming did not. George Foreman spent 30 years answering one question: who am I? The first answer was borrowed from Sonny Liston and built on sand. The second one came on a dressing room floor, but it took 10 years of silence to understand it. The third is the one his sons carry, a name rebuilt from the ground up and given away as a promise that they would always belong. You are not required to be the person that you built to survive your worst years. That person did their job. You can let them go. He walked into the ring in Zaire wearing rage like a uniform. 20 years later, he walked into a ring in the same red velvet trunks. A different man was inside them. And the different man won. This has been Gut. Thanks for listening. If this episode meant something to you, share it with someone who needs to hear it. Like, subscribe, and leave a rating on your platform of choice. See you next week.